All right, guys, welcome back to the Yes Means Yes podcast. On this week's episode, we are going to be talking with some individuals about the LGBTQ plus community and sexual assault. So I'm going to go ahead and let everyone introduce themselves, and then we'll get started.
Hey y'all, I'm Brittany. I'm an intern this semester at Rape Counselors of East Alabama. I am 24. I go by she, her, hers. I'm a cis heterosexual female. I just moved to Auburn, Alabama about a year ago, and I'm originally from Louisville, Kentucky.
I'll go next. Hi, I'm Nelson Deluca. I'm the training coordinator at the Alabama Coalition Against Rape. I go by he, him pronouns. I'm 28. I have been with my partner, who is also male, for about 8 years. And my background's in like training and direct services, because I used to work as like an educator, a public educator, and then I worked at a homeless shelter. Then I was an advocate at a DV shelter, and now I'm here.
Hi, I'm Saturn Star Shooter. My pronouns are my name. I also use they, them, there, but I prefer my name. Let's see, I identify as a fluid alien queer person. I don't know what that means, but it means everything. I just graduated from, I'm an alumni from UK. I graduated with gender and women's studies, and I'm wrapping up my African-American studies major, and I minored in philosophy. I'm currently in the drag scene right now. I do like drag performance. And so that's just kind of like where I'm at right now, just like fluid performing and like just kind of like trying to be fully invested in like the club scenes in Lexington and just being around queer folks in general. Yeah.
Okay, so my first question on the list, and y'all can kind of like answer it, like Faith said, as in-depth or as vague as you want, but to your all's knowledge, like how common is sexual assault amongst the LGBTQ plus community?
I'll speak on that. So a lot of the data that I've seen show that it is more common than for the cisgender heterosexual community, and the reporting numbers are lower than in the cisgender heterosexual community. So, you know, we can definitely say that it's more prevalent, but we don't necessarily know how much more prevalent, especially in states like Alabama, where there's a lot of people who are closeted and wouldn't report anyway.
I find that like it's pretty like it's a thing. It's just that people don't talk about it. I've noticed that like when it comes to queer folks, it's almost like, yeah, that wouldn't happen. But I'm like, no, like it's there. It's and especially being like in the club scene, a lot of the rhetoric that is surrounded around like rape culture and everything is very relevant, and a lot of people are like kind of give the excuse like you wouldn't find that at a queer club. And I'm like, no, but you see people actively engaging in that. I've even had people engage with me in really uncomfortable ways. So I don't know in terms of like data specifically, though I do know that like it's something that's pretty common, and it's not something that's talked about a lot. It's actually kind of frustrating because I feel like especially in a lot of queer scenes, primarily like in club scenes or bars, because that's where a lot of queer folks tend to come together. There's opportunities and things that are being created like alcohol, drugs, and sex. All of those things get together are like create like, yeah, it's just, it can create like an unholy trinity essentially. And I think that it's not something that's discussed. There is a lot of unhealthy relationships when it comes to drugs and alcohol, and a lot of times like sexual assault does happen, but it's not labeled as sexual assault. And so that's something that I've been noticing this like in the like club scene that's like not discussed often. So it's there. It's more of a discussion of how like when do we shed light on it. So yeah.
I could definitely attest to that. Like just working for a 24-hour crisis hotline, Faith, I don't know if you've experienced this too, but a lot of times people will call and be like, is this sexual assault? Like, I don't know, like it made me uncomfortable, but I don't know if that's assault. And, we're always like, yeah, like if that's how you took it, then yeah, that's, assault. So I definitely agree that it probably goes way underreported. And it's, like you said, it's just like an uncomfortable talk. Like sexual assault in general is uncomfortable for people to talk about. And then you like cross intersect that with a different topic that people also are uncomfortable talking about, like the LGBTQ community. And it just like knocks it even further down the totem pole. So,
and I also wanted to interject. So I think that we as society have this idea of the perfect or victim and who can be sexually assaulted, and who cannot be sexually assaulted. And I think that most oftentimes falls to, okay, well, the people that really experience rape are like cis hetero women. And it's because of this, whatever. So I think what we've been trying to do, and Nelson and advocates everywhere, has been kind of trying to change that idea and that mindset into anyone can be a victim, does not matter race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender, sexuality, none of that is relevant. And it doesn't make it more, I guess, that perfect victim or less that perfect victim, because they don't fall into those categories. So I think it's really just changing that mindset and changing that idea around who is a victim and who's not a victim in our society.
I respect that. If I can add more onto that, like I like how you said, like in terms of like victims, and on the other hand, like it's just the same as like the culprit of it all. Like it doesn't make you any different. I identify as a stripper too, so I also strip as well in terms of do drag. And I've just had people like just touch me without my permission, or just like grope me, and I'm just like, just because I present a certain way, and especially like in queer culture being very open and expressive, it's like a lot of people misinterpret as like this is like an invitation for you to touch me. And I've realized that like I've had to set up a lot of boundaries, especially like being vulnerable with my body. And I think that there's this idea of like, oh, if I go to a straight bar, I know that I can risk being assaulted, but if I go to the queer bar, that's not a thing. And I think I was alluding to that earlier, but it's like, no, like it's this idea of like anybody can be a culprit just as much as anybody can be a victim. It goes both ways. And I think that I really enjoyed that you brought that up, because I feel like it is kind of uneven, and it lets people get away with it, and it doesn't let us like say like, actually this is you're like you're at fault for that.
I think that's a great segue into our next question, which is like, what types of microaggressions or assaults might people in the LGBTQ community face? And if y'all want to speak on your own experiences or just like stories that you've heard.
Well, I'll say, I mean, we were kind of getting into this, like with the way that straight people think about sexual assault and sexual violence. It's all very heteronormative and binary, and it's very focused on, men and women, and it can't happen outside of those parameters. I mean, Alabama didn't even have laws specifying, that two men could engage in that. It was exclusively men, and it was like vaginal penetration. And slowly we're making changes, but the way that people think about it is just so different outside of the community. And like Saturn was saying, people come into queer spaces and consider them to be a safe space for them, and they're invading this space with this assumption that they're safe here, and they don't know that it can happen anywhere, or it can be anyone.
I think there's a few things. Like, I think that a lot of situations that open up the floodgates to like sexual assault or just like sexual unwantedness, I would say, is the idea that like you hate us but you want to be us. So you would call me a faggot, and you would say that you hate trannies, i.e. me, and all of these things, but yet you want me. Very outward. Like, I think that like I'm very explicit about that because I've noticed that like a lot of folks are just like, I don't like trans people and everything, but they fetishize that. And so it's like, it develops this like weird hate love relationship. And oftentimes I found that like a lot of times that comes out in like a very aggressive ways of talking to people. I've also found that like a lot of times it's internalized sexual prejudice. So a lot of these people themselves are queer, but are struggling to negotiate their own heteronormativity with that. And with that comes with anger. I've noticed like, I bring up my own personal example as I was like almost sexually assaulted by somebody who was really close to me. And then years later coming to find out that he was actually gay. And I was like, wow, like that was like, it really sat in my head. It was like, and I hated him for the longest time, but then I was like, oh, it makes sense why you did that. Is like you had just like this internalized hatred and then you place that onto other people and that comes out in violent, aggressive ways. I feel like in terms of microaggressions, I've noticed it's the diction that I really sit on. I've noticed that in a lot of queer spaces, people say things but don't realize the full magnitude of them. And it creates it normalizes that. I don't know, just like when I go out and I go out just like as a stripper, like people very much like sexualize me and will only like limit me down and objectify me. They're like, oh, you have a nice, or like the way your legs look and all of these things, and like they begin to just like they focus on my body rather than it actually focusing on like the art of it. um and I noticed that a lot of it I think comes back to like objectification and things like that. So when it comes to like hating LGBTQ folks, I find like a lot of times those people just have their own internalized hatred, and that just comes out in very aggressive, violent ways. And another thing is that I find that a lot of people still a lot of heteronormativity bleeds into the queer community. So it's like um, a lot of the times the things that are said in straight spaces are the same in queer spaces. They're not mutually exclusive at times. But I feel like it's an interesting dynamic for sure. So yeah.
Right, I totally agree. And getting into that heteronormativity, like one of the things that me and my partner get a lot of times is like, who's the more masculine and who's the more feminine one in the relationship. And we're both men and we like it that way. It's on purpose. And but then again, as Saturn was saying, that does get into queer spaces too. There's people that, as kind of a protective factor, will fall into those norms and try to have these gender roles so that they can outwardly be more acceptable to the straight society.
Yes, and I would want to add more onto that. Like, a lot of people just see the way that I like exist, and they like try to box me into gender categories. And when I say them like this genderless alien, I say it because it's like it's fun, it's different, it's weird, and like I've noticed a lot of people attempt to feminize me, and then when they feminize me, they engage in very like hyper masculine, dominant ways of engaging with me, and it's like this weird power play. And I look at them like, what are you doing? Flip side too, like a lot of people emasculate me or masculinize me and then paint me as this like hypersexual figure, and I'm like, no. And oftentimes in queer spaces I realize it is very hypersexualized, and I think that's like the reason like it sets the foundation for a lot of these things to happen, is because we're viewed as sexually deviant. So I feel like because of that we become a lot of queer folks embody that, and that's just not, I think that's like an unhealthy relationship to kind of develop with your own identity and the community writ large.
Right, like the queer community is seen as like sexually deviant, and I think that a lot of times in the community we try to be really accepting of anybody who has any kind of like whatever with their sexuality, and that is automatically a risk factor for sexual assault because there's more of that sexual freedom taking place. And then as far as microaggressions go, I think that opens the door for people that LGBT survivors disclose to not believe them or minimize the victimization that they experience.
Yeah, speaking of the minimization and microaggressions, I just like from what I've seen, I know a lot of people, I'm from Louisville, which is a big city, but it's still like kind of southern. And a lot of people just outright refuse to like acknowledge people by their pronouns or by their like new name. And it's, I don't get it. I'm just what does it hurt you? Like, why do you refuse to just, I don't know, be a decent person?
Yeah, or Nelson, do you want to go? Okay. Another thing is that like me just being like a person of color that's queer, I've noticed that like, and especially like predominantly white spaces, PWSs. I've noticed that like white folks hypersexualize me just as a black and brown person, and like I've noticed people say like, "Oh, I bet you're like freaky and bad" and things like that. And I'm like, is it because I'm black and brown? Is that why? Do you think I'm really that sexually deviant? Like, and on top of being queer, it's like it feels like I have like these like a Jenga tower. Like it just feels like things are being stacked on for me, and I'm like, and they're like ready to topple it over. And I don't get, and it goes back to like fetishization and things like that, which again stems a lot from like heteronormativity and just like ownership and colloquial ways of understanding the world. But it is interesting seeing like how the intersectionality of a lot of these things and how it does lead into sexual assault. And I think a lot of it does come like from fetishization and like creating false ideas from social constructs that really hurt us on a day-by-day basis.
Okay, so then the next question was, is sexual assault towards LGBTQ plus individuals considered a hate crime, both like legally in your state and in your opinion?
I'll let Saturn go first on this one since I've been taking the mic.
Go ahead, baby.
Okay, thank you. Well, in Alabama, it's not. Alabama doesn't have any protections. Sorry, it's thundering, but Alabama doesn't have any protections against discrimination for any LGBT community members. In my opinion, I mean, it's a hate crime if it was done because of their identity. So if this isn't really as big of a thing anymore, I don't think, but there used to be like corrective rape where when people found out that there was a queer person around, they would like set up this whole thing to, like, if it's a man, they would try to make them have sex with a woman or force them to have sex with a woman to like fix them. So that's what I mean, hate crime based on, you know, if it was because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or that kind of stuff. But legally, no. In Alabama, there is no protection against that.
I'll guess I'll start off with my opinion, and I'm having a hard time wording this, so I'll just like say it and we'll see what happens. I feel like each of us, like our bodies are our temples, right? And I feel like we every day we reserve that and we protect it in ways. We meditate, we work out, we breathe and we walk. And we allow certain people in our temple and we allow those not in our temple. And I feel like at any point, I feel like if you forcefully inject yourself into my temple, then you hate my temple. Um, there's a hatred, there's no love. So on the, you know what I mean? Because it's absent of love, then to me that reads as hatred. And disrespect and dishonesty and all of these other things. So for me, whether if it's recognized as a hate crime by law or not, it is a hateful thing to do. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier. A lot of times people do these things because of self-hatred. And so I think that that's what it comes down to me. Like, regardless if the law recognizes it or not, I still think it's a hateful act because it's an act of self-hatred that you are projecting onto other people and you're not respecting other people's temples and well-being and peace. Um, that's where I come down to it. And you know, there's a lot to navigate with that. But I feel like absent gender identity and race, because I feel like oftentimes we get bogged up in those conversations. But just as people, like we're people and we deserve our temples, we reserve the right to have peace. And that's what it comes down to.
For me, I don't want to take away from like the hate crime aspect, but I do feel like rape in general is a hate crime. Just like Saturn was kind of saying, like it's a hateful act. And whether it's like hate towards women or hate towards LGBTQ or hate towards people of color, like whatever you want to say, like in my opinion, yeah, it's almost always a hate crime. But yeah, I was looking at some statistics before the meeting, and it is just wild to think, like Nelson said, that there's no protection. Like I just, you would think that it's 2022 and everyone should be progressive now and like things have changed, but that's not the case at all. So from the statistics that I had sent to you guys, I don't know if y'all had a chance to look at them, but how do those make you all feel? Just like the rates that this happens at and the laws that do or don't exist.
Well, I saw those, and some of them are stuff that I actually use. So thank you. I'm glad that we were using the same data. But yeah, I mean, with it, it shows that transgender women of color are at the highest risk, and I think that knowing these statistics kind of should inform us on how we should approach. Lowering those statistics, because it's like 47 or 48% of transgender people experience sexual violence during their lifetime. I mean, that's like half. The same goes for bisexual men and women. And I think that all comes down to what Saturn was saying about the fetishization, the dehumanization, the racism, and the sexism. All those isms, all those phobias come into play. And I mean, the statistics just kind of prove what we're saying about how big this issue is. I think that it's hard though, because since I do like train on this stuff and I see a lot of different statistics about a lot of different groups, there's a lot of work to be done for a lot of people as far as sexual assault goes, not just with the LGBT community. And I think that in general, reducing the amount of sexual violence will help the community because of the gender norms associated with everything, and how we were talking about heteronormativity and how that plays into rape culture, and that sexism is really pervasive within the community. So fighting all of those things that intersect with what we're talking about here, I think that that's just as important as talking about this community.
Yeah, so I just took a quick glance at these. I'm not shocked. I mean, like, I don't know, I guess just kind of like I live this every day, so I'm very aware of these things. Like, I guess like, it's kind of a lot to consume that though every day. I think that's the other aspect of it, is that like people are not talking about like how much that's a lot to consume for us on a daily basis. You know what I mean? Like it's a lot to see on the news that like another Black person or another queer person got killed. You know what I'm saying? Or like sexually assaulted or raped or killed. Like that's just like, where's the therapy in that? And I find that like just seeing that like Black lesbian women are more likely to be sexually assaulted and killed, like more likely to be sexually assaulted, more likely to be declined from jobs, like bisexual men it's like, whoa. I will say, being in Lexington though, I find like a lot of peace, and I was like reading the little pamphlet that was there, and it does make me feel good being in Lexington because there are a lot of queer folks here, so I feel like there's a little bit more like, sure, we're kind of red and like people are still trying to understand, but I feel like Lexington and Louisville specifically I can speak to, there's more of an understanding, even though people may not be receptive to like people's pronouns and stuff. I feel like there's more protection and like more understanding of just like our well-being. Another statistic, I don't have data, but I do know that like because queer folks are a lot of times are not out to their family members, a lot of them engage in risky behavior. And because of that, that's like why a lot of other cases go unreported, or a lot of more sexual assault happens, is because they're having like risky link ups. It's also a higher risk for like STDs and HIV/AIDS. Like it leads into like a whole plethora of other issues. So I think that like the data to me is not surprising. But again, it does help. Like it makes me feel good that like there is like in Lexington, like our Kentucky Violence Against Women Act that could like co-opt queer folks. So I mean, it's cool that there is some like initiatives or some stuff in play, but like I think that there needs to be more done to reduce sexual assault, but I think there needs to be done more at a root level, and a lot of this is like local and community based. And not just like because it's statistics, but like where are these locally happening in certain places? Like is sexual assault happening in this location more than others? Is this happening more to Black queer folks? Like is this happening to more bisexual folks? And um yeah, I think that there just needs to be a more like local focus. I feel, I think that would help. Yeah.
No, I agree. And, I just want to point out, Saturn, that when you said, you were saying, like, I know that in Lexington and here where I'm at, that they're not really as accepting of pronouns and stuff, but it's still better than, other places. Maybe you're thinking it's still better than Alabama, but it's kind of, we're having to make compromises, because we're having to take these, take incremental little baby step wins with everything. I just wanted to point that out because I thought it was, it struck me because I was like, well, we're still having to make excuses for the homophobia and transphobia. It's just wild, and I think that plays into all of this. When if anybody has a reason to, in their head, dehumanize another person, to them that can justify any violence that they are wanting to commit.
Yeah, I also feel that like a lot of like I'm looking at like nku.edu, and they're like, here's what to do when this happens, and it's like not that doesn't work all the time though. Like it's not like there's not like actual like trans resources. Like me as like a trans person, there's not an actual like trans, I mean there's spaces in Lexington, sure, but like a lot of them are white. So like when I go to these spaces and I'm telling them how I feel, it's like really hard for them to be quite receptive to it, because you don't have like queer trans people, you don't have queer people in these spaces, or queer people of color in these spaces, and oftentimes the violence that we face is much different from like white queer people. And I think there's this idea that this one size fits all, and it's like, no, like you may not understand what I'm saying, but don't act like you understand. You can at least say that we're on the same shoe rack. That'll make me feel better. But like when you say that, well, this fits it all, it's like, no, that's the issue. So the data for me is like, it's again not shocking, but it's just more so speaks to like, and I like how you said like we're always having to like compromise on something. I think that's just like we always are compromising, and there isn't compromise on the flip side. Like there isn't like non like queer people being like, hey, actually we realize how messed up this is. But I think the reason why that is because there isn't like coalitions actually happening. Like people will say that they're for us and like turn around and like post a brochure, or they'll like we have this new office in town, but there's not actual like critical discussion happening around this. Like we have the data, but are we having podcasts like these where we engage in the critical conversation about like, what does it mean to have that data? What is the impact of that? What does that look like? What do we do with that? You know what I'm saying? That isn't happening often.
Something else y'all have touched on a lot, and just wanted to see if any expansions needed to be made. What kind of intersectionalities do you see? And I know, Saturn, you talked about LGBTQ and then people of color. We've talked about like gender, all of that. What, like, are there any other intersectionalities y'all wanted to touch on one last time?
Class. 150, I don't even know percent. I don't even know infinite percent. I don't know. Like people do not talk about the amount of issues that stem from class. And I think that's the reason like why a lot of these issues happen, is because class hides behind a lot of these things. Class hides behind race, class hides behind gender. It just, mystifies itself and we don't talk about it. And in a lot of cases, like a lot of violence is happening in low income areas, and people prey on that too. um I was reading about like unwanted gifts and stuff. People lure like people from lower income areas, like rich folks, do that. They manipulate lower income folks, and that leads to very aggressive assault. It's interesting because like I'm in a space. I go to these queer spaces, right, and a lot of them like are people who are like well off to do, and you see the way that they like financially put holds over people, and they create this weird like classist mindset, and it's like, of course you're gonna view yourself as less than, and like allow negative things to happen to you because you're not being empowered in your own class stance. You know what I mean? Like you're being knocked down every day. So it all comes back to class. I think that yeah, yeah, I think that's it. It's just class.
I agree. Like everybody has kind of their own metric in their head of like, these are the different boxes that I can check to determine whether or not someone is like a high class person or a low class person. And I totally agree. I think that it does fall behind everything. If you know that classism comes down to that dehumanization again, and people who are lower on the socioeconomic scale often are the most heavily taken advantage of, victimized, and it starts this cycle and keeps it going, and it's hard to stop. And I also wanted to talk about with intersectionality, how within the community, like just because we are all on the LGBTQ spectrum, or all different places on the gender spectrum, doesn't mean that there's not racist gay people, there's not racist trans people. And that's something within our own community that we're having to deal with. There is sexism within the community as well. And back with those gender norms that we were talking about earlier, like when Saturn was talking about being more feminized, having those gender norms just impressed upon you, and people act differently based on how they perceive you. So it's not just from the outside in, it's also so invasive. And all of us are trying to survive however we can. And some of us are trying to like assimilate into that heteronormative societal expectation of them. And so then all the bad quality. I have a friend who, he's transgender, and sometimes I have to call him out because I'm like, you're really being toxic right now about how aggressive you're being. Like it's like you're just exemplifying all this toxic masculinity, and it's like, stop, like, so it's not something that is just outside.
I've noted, or you can go, Britt.
You can go ahead.
Thank you, baby. I think like I've realized this, like people will say really terrible things to me and then hop in their Teslas, and that geeks me. You can afford to be. I think that's what it comes down to. You can afford to. You can afford. You are privileged. And not to say like sexual assault is a privileged thing, because there are moments where it is not, and it happens within our own class standing. But like a piece of me is just like, a lot of these perpetrators are often people who do view themselves as higher, and it goes back to that dehumanization. Because you view me as less, you're going to treat me like I'm nothing. And it's interesting because I realized like I've been standing up for myself, and I tell people, I'm like, I see what you're doing, and you're like, I see you, just know that. And they're like, and they walk away from me, and I'm like, it's because I'm not going to let you like make me feel or categorize me. And I think that's what it comes down to. Like, even though your girl is really broke, I'm not gonna let you treat me like some broke girl. Like you know what I mean? I'm gonna treat myself like that, and because my broke girl meals and stuff. But I'm not gonna let you like give me a value based on that, because I'm a very valuable person outside of money. That, you know what I mean? But that isn't, again, that's not really happening, and I'm actually really glad we're talking about this. Brittany, I want to hear what you gotta say.
No, I had to give you an APO knock because when you said that, it just brought up so many. I actually wrote like a paper for one of my classes not that long ago, and a whole section was just talking about how people of different classes are treated so differently, like from law enforcement to the hospital to, I mean, just everything. And I'm talking about like RCEA and Nelson. I'm sure you've seen it too in your organization, but I mean, I've had a lot of cases with white college girls, and they're treated very differently than, the lady on food stamps from Opelika. That, it's infuriating. We Amanda, even the other day, and I wish Amanda could have joined us on this call, but she was telling me a story that she had to like go find a nurse and track her down in the hospital and like put her in her place and just be like, you're a nursing student, but like just for when you continue this profession, like you cannot treat people like that. Like you cannot just throw their food at them like they're a dog. Like that's not okay. And I can only imagine how like being LGBTQ or person of color just compounds that. That it like I notice it too, and I hope that one day I can be comfortable enough to be one of those people that says, I see you and you need to put yourself in check. Because I'm not a confrontational person, but yeah, it goes right through me. Another intersectionality I was kind of thinking about when looking at the data was domestic violence. And I think that a lot of times like domestic violence and sexual assault are used interchangeably, and they're not. But I just wonder, like, I was just talking about how law enforcement treats people differently, like how they would treat people differently if they got, a house call to like two gay men or two lesbian women. Like, I just wonder how they would treat that differently. And we have another organization here in Auburn called the Domestic Violence Intervention Center. And a lot of times people will call us thinking that we deal with domestic violence, or they'll call them thinking they deal with sexual assault. And I think it's like important to distinguish the two.
I totally agree. Oh, sorry, Faith.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, well, and while we're talking about other intersections with sexual violence, you've also got human trafficking. I used to work at it was like a human trafficking, homeless shelter, resource center type thing for 19 to 24-year-olds, so younger. And I would say, I mean, I think the statistic is like 40% of the homeless population is on the LGBTQ spectrum. I would say 70% of the people I worked with were, queer in some way. And a lot of those risk factors, the stuff that contributes to higher rates of sexual violence also contributes to higher rates of domestic violence and human trafficking. I mean, we had like younger people coming into town in Birmingham, Alabama, and one person was like, where can I find the nearest, corner, pimp, that kind of thing. It's all about that survival thing. And I think a lot of times with domestic violence, you see that financial manipulation, isolation, a lot of times within couples in the LGBT community. Oh, and that goes back to class as well. Like someone who's privileged and has money will find someone who needs money or a place to live and basically become that person's abuser.
So what I was going to say is I think there's almost like this underlying message that if you fall into any of certain categories, you have less control over your body and you have less power over your body, and your body's not as much yours. And we've seen this, Brittany, Nelson, in sexual assault cases. Well, if you were drinking, if you were on drugs, if you were a sex worker, if you were a person of color, if you were someone who did not, identify as a female or male gender. So if you are a woman whose husband did it, right? So those kind of thoughts and thought processes, that there are, I guess, some people have more power over their bodies and more autonomy over their bodies because they didn't put themselves in these positions or because of the situation. And I think that that's a really dangerous message that has been consistently seen over and over and over again.
And I'm wondering if like I haven't worked with any cases, even though I really want to. I'm actually trying to like get my foothold into like working with an organization. Um, and I'm wondering if like one way to resolve that is to like move away from categories and rather just see people as people and focus on the situation itself. And I think the society just focuses too much on like race and all of these other categories. And like me as like a person of color, I like identify as myself, but I identify as me, but like I've been taking the time to like really just understand people based on their geographical location rather than like identifying them. And I've noticed that like my brain has almost been like been reworking itself. Because you're right. I feel like whenever we do add labels onto people, we're like, well, of course that'll happen to you. You know what I'm saying? Or I even have people tell me when they touch me, like, well, of course you like take off your clothes and you're nude. And I'm like, no. I'm like, no, like that doesn't mean anything. And I think that like it goes back to like when Nelson was saying like compromising. We should not be compromising. It is not, no matter what you are, it's really not okay. And it goes back again to just like us recognizing each other, just like you have a temple, we all have temples, we deserve peace. And empathy is really what it comes down to too, like just being empathetic towards people and understanding situations. um yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah, no, I think so too. I think so too. And with what you were saying about like all these different labels and stuff, it's really funny because I feel like the LGBTQ community is like really into labels right now, and there's a new like sexual orientation, you know, every year they come out with a new one. I mean, and to me, with the way that I like train on that is saying like, here's a bunch of flags. We love a flag, right? You know, we want representation, and I think that that's really important uh, as a community for us, allowing us to kind of explore ourselves and kind of more solidify who we are as the LGBT community while also retaining our individuality because there's so much intersection. But when it comes down to an outsider perspective looking in, none of those labels really matter. You need to look at that person, as a human being who deserves the same, you know, treatment as everybody else here.
So we had a guest on a few months ago, and she said something that's really, really stuck with me. So she described a scenario where two people go on a date, they have drinks, they have dinner, they go back to her place, and then one of them ends up murdering the other. And that's just called murder, right? That's not called date murder. But if you switch the situation around, if that was a rape case, it would be considered date rape or a marital rape or all this. So I think going back to all that, you know, it's just rape. Let's just call it what it is. It's rape. Doesn't matter. We don't need these labels to it. So I don't know. That was just something I'd never heard before. And when she told me about it, I was like, okay, I like that.
Right. No, I mean, that's part of the reason that ACAR is the Alabama Coalition Against Rape, because it's like, say it. Don't call it regretful sex or anything. You know, it is a crime. And, you know, we're focused on like legislation and stuff a lot of times because there are legal definitions of rape and things that, you know, it's all laid out. We don't have to put all these other labels onto it. We know what rape is, so call it what it is. Don't say something that could, I mean, I feel like when you say date rape, it almost automatically makes someone kind of minimize it, you know, because all of a sudden they're like, oh, okay, so it's not just boogeyman jumping out of the bushes, kidnapping someone and raping them. It was a whole thing. It was a production or whatever, you know. So yeah, with the labels and stuff, no need for that. Just call it what it is. Rape is rape. Sexual violence is sexual violence, and sexual assault is sexual assault.
Okay, so since we're getting close to our hour mark, we're gonna just skip to our very last question, which is, what is your message to survivors, if you have one?
I just want to say a message to service providers first. Something that I do a lot in my training is try to focus it on preparing an agency to receive LGBTQ clients or people seeking services. So just think about, and this is something I really wanted to make sure to touch on here, just think about religious sensitivity, because there's a lot of faith communities here in Alabama doing some really awesome work. I mean, as far as like tangible services go, getting people gas cards, um, finding housing for them, helping them pay their utility bills. Our faith ministries are on top of it, and a lot of us nonprofit people rely on them for our clients. And so that's really amazing and great that we have such community doing that stuff. But it's really important to remember that while we have those communities, there are still people, a lot of people in Alabama, who have been harmed because people use their religious beliefs, what the words in the Bible say, what their pastor says, preacher, whoever. They use those words to justify the harm that they're doing to other people. So it's just really important for everybody to remember that even the most well-intentioned, cross on the wall, Bible verse, inspirational poster, it can become threatening if a queer person walks into your office seeking services and they see something like that, some kind of religious iconography. That can be threatening, and they may think, oh, these services aren't for me. And then for survivors, I just want to say we are here in the movement, doing this work too. Queer people are here. That's why we're doing this podcast. And there are, I don't know about resources in Kentucky, but in Alabama, there are 16 member rape crisis centers that are membership of ACAR. And all of them, even though our state doesn't have the anti-discrimination policy, our membership does. And they're here to serve everyone, and they employ people from the community. I am proof of that.
To survivors, I would say continue to seek peace, and you are loved. I think that I want to combine the other two questions that were here is like, how do we create a safer space for each other and everything like that? Like, just like love, I think that's what it comes down to. Like, when really bad things like when things like sexual assault happen, I feel like we can create like a lot of animosity towards the world, and be like, I hate these, I hate this group, I hate that group, and it's like, and that's okay. And it's like pushing folks to continue to like seek peace. Like, where do you find peace? And like bringing each other together and like looking at the person next to you and smiling. I think that like it goes back to what I was saying about a lot of the self-hatred. I think that's like why things happen, is just because people are not loved. They're really not. People are not loved and seen. And like, I think naturally we will see a gradual decline in just like hate-based cases in general, just by reminding people that they're loved, and like regardless of where you're at. So even if you're going to call me the N-word or faggot, I love you, and I hope you find peace. And I think that that's just a very positive mindset. And I think that even me saying that, it makes my heart feel good, because I think that we're so quick to fire back at each other, and it's like, yeah, you'll find peace. I think that's what it comes down to for me. So that's my message.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. This was a really good discussion. It went longer than I thought it was going to, but I think that's a good thing. Faith, do you have anything to add?
No, just again, thank you guys for joining us so much. I feel like we went like off, but like they were all really good points and really good discussions to talk about, and I wish that we had another hour. But Yeah, thanks you guys for coming. Thank you, Brittany, for doing a great job on this podcast. And to everyone listening, we will see you on the next episode. Thank you.